Here, doesn't it? Yeah, feels like we're finally here. Well, this morning we're gonna talk about crutches. Now, I don't know about you. I've never had a broken leg, but I did have an injury in high school when I was playing on the basketball team. I had a knee injury, and I had to miss the rest of the season. And for several months, I was hobbling around on a crutch like this. Didn't have to have two of them, but I had to have one for sure. Now, I don't know about you. Anybody else ever had to use a crutch in here? Anybody? Okay, do you remember how awkward that felt when you first started using this thing? I mean, they get in the way, and then what happens? After a while, if you do too much walking, pretty soon the armpits get a little sore, don't they? Underneath. And then what happens when you have to sit down somewhere? Where are you going to put this? You know, they ought to make one that's collapsible, don't you think? That maybe you could just collapse it and go under the table or something? Boy, I tell you, these things can really, really be a problem. But today, as we look at the life of David, we're going to continue our series. This is part 3 in our series on the life of David. I know that while not everyone has always needed to use a crutch or crutches, yet, you know what? We all have some broken places in our lives. We all have some areas in our life where we're not as whole emotionally, maybe as we would like to be. And so we often find ourselves leaning on certain things to sort of give us support in life. It can be people, it can be our positions, it can be a number of different things that we tend to lean on for support and stability. And guess what? When we do that, every once in a while, God has to come along, and you know what He does with some of those crutches in our life? Every once in a while, God comes along, and we do a little too much leaning on other things, and every once in a while, what does God have to do? He has to knock them aside. He has to throw them down. Because instead of leaning on Jesus, we sometimes end up leaning on other things. And you know, crutches can be a help when you've got a physical injury. But when we spend too much time leaning emotionally on other things other than the Lord, that can sometimes not only delay the healing, it can prevent God from healing some of the deeper things that we need to look at and address in our lives. So we're going to take a look this morning. If you have your Bible or you've got your phone with you, we're going to be in 1 Samuel, chapters 18 through 21. We're going to look a little span in David's life here, where we find that some of the crutches that David had been depending on, God had to knock away. God had to remove so that David's focus could be more centered on the Lord instead of other things. So let's kind of pick up the story. Let me give you a little bit of the historical context as we come today to 1 Samuel chapter 18. Remember, David has just defeated Goliath in chapter 17. And all of Israel has suddenly become his fans. And they are cheering for him, and they are yelling for him, and you know, he has become the main guy in Israel. And so he is invited to join Saul's army. And we pick up the story here in 1 Samuel 18, beginning in verse 5. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming when David returned from killing the Philistine. Notice the Philistine. Who are we talking about there, you think? Goliath. That the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they've ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And then this note is added. Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Well, because of David's growing popularity with the people of Israel following his victory over Goliath, Saul became jealous of David and would literally stop at nothing to get him out of the way. In fact, if you look with me at verse 10, remember this story. It says, now, as it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand. And a spear was in Saul's hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence. And notice what it says. Once, twice. This happened more than once. Saul wanted to get rid of David. First, he tried to do it himself. Then, secondly, the Bible tells us he sent him into battle, one battle after another, hoping the enemy would kill him. And then when that didn't succeed, then he thought, well, I'll make David my son-in-law. He can marry my daughter Michal, and I'll just tell him that a little dowry will be required. And so he said, David, if you can go out and bring evidence to me that you've killed 100 Philistines, you can marry my daughter. Well, that didn't work either, because David collected, and he came back, and he married his daughter. So then what did Saul do? In final desperation, he puts out a bounty. He puts out a reward for David's life among all the Israelites. Anybody that can kill David, I will reward them. So because of all of these things that are happening in David's life, talk about a crippling crisis. David was facing something he'd never dealt with before, and because of that, he was clinging to some supports in his life. He leaned on several different crutches, as we are all likely to do over the course of our lives. And even though David had never done anything wrong to warrant Saul's vengeful anger, yet God still chose in this season in David's life to pull some crutches out from underneath him. So let's see what that looked like this morning. We're going to discover today that God had to remove 5 different crutches in David's life. And as we walk through these today, I wonder how many of these we can identify with personally in our own life. What were the crutches that God had to remove in David's life? All right, crutch number 1, if you have your outline with you this morning, crutch number 1, first of all, God had to deal with David's position, his position. Would you look with me as we come now to 1 Samuel 19? We're going to begin reading in verse 8. When there was war again, David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with great slaughter, so that they fled before him. Now, this is going to sound familiar. Here's that second time we were talking about with the spear. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped out of Saul's presence so that he stuck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Well, when he returns once again, victorious over the Philistines, what happened? Saul's jealousy again gets the best of him, and he tries to murder David now this second time. But David escapes. And in the process, he's leaving behind his military position, his military career, and he leaves and goes out on his own as a fugitive, never to return to the king's palace again. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever lost your position? Have you ever been fired from a job? Have you ever been demoted? Have you ever been let go? I was just talking with Pastor Joel, our Spanish pastor, the other day, and he's been working for Comcast, that puts in the cabling and does all that kind of stuff with TV and the internet, and he's been a supervisor with Comcast for about the last 4 years, and he confided in us and said in our staff meeting, he said, there's some discussions going on with management, and there's a new contract that we're trying to get put forth as employees, and if they don't accept the contract, then a lot of us are going to be let go. I said, we'll be praying about that, Pastor Joel. We'll be praying for you and for Comcast. If you've ever lost your position, if you've ever lost something that was near and dear to your heart, then you know something of what David might have been experiencing and feeling here. But sometimes the problem is we can get feeling so comfortable and so relaxed. Everything seems to be secure and predictable and stable. And it's in those times that we can sometimes find ourselves leaning more on our position or our status or our place where we live instead of on the Lord. So David had to lose that crutch. He was a fugitive. He was on the run. He was now a hunted and wanted man. Well, that brings us to a second crutch that God had to deal with in David's life. Number 2, and that has to do with David's own wife, Michal. And we're going to read about that in chapter 19, beginning in verse 11. As Saul is seeking David, notice where he goes. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, "If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death." So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. Michal took the household idol and laid it on the bed and put a quilt of goat's hair at its head and covered it with cloths. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, "He is sick." Then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, "Bring him to me. Bring him in his bed, that I may put him to death." When the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed, with the quilt of goat's hair at its head. So Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this? And let my enemy go, so that he has escaped." And Michal said to Saul, notice these words, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I put you to death?'" You say, what's going on here? Well, Saul pursued David all the way to his home, where he was to be found with his wife Michal. And that night, David was to be killed, but his wife helped him escape. But her loyalty proved false, didn't it? For when asked by her father why she let David escape, she explained to him, "Well, he threatened to kill me, and that's why I let him go. That's why I helped him." She was looking out for her own interests, wasn't she? Instead of being loyal to David, Michal betrayed her husband, never offering one single word in support of him as her husband. Have you ever had someone in your life that you trusted who let you down? Ever had someone betray you and turn against you and say things about you or do things that affected your life, your position, your career? I remember once in a church where I served, there was a staff member who went rogue and tried to lead a coup against me as the pastor. It's amazing what some people can do. And if you've ever had someone betray you, if you've ever had somebody turn against you, you know how disappointing that can be. Sometimes how disillusioning and discouraging that can be. Well, God's not finished removing the crutches in David's life yet. For there's a third crutch that David is going to lose, and that is his mentor. His mentor. And we're going to read about that here in chapter 19. Would you notice with me verses 18 and 19? Where did David go now that he was on the run? Notice what it says. Now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. It was told Saul, saying, Behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Now, if you'll turn to chapter 20 for just a moment, look at verse 1. Because Saul had discovered where David was, he could no longer stay in Naioth. And notice what it said. David then fled from Naioth to Ramah. He's on the run again. So when David first ran from Saul's palace, where did he go? He went to his mentor Samuel, the one who had anointed him, the one who had given him guidance and counsel. And he explained to him all that Saul had been trying to do. And Samuel suggested they take refuge in Naioth. But Saul discovers their hiding place. So David again is on the run, leaves his mentor Samuel behind. I think this may have been the most difficult crutch of all for David to lose in his life. If you've ever found yourself relying on someone, only to have their presence, their companionship, their fellowship, their guidance, and their counsel in your life suddenly removed, that can be devastating. It might be a trusted friend that you lost. It could be a mentor or a coach or even your spouse. Someone you looked up to for guidance, support, counsel, advice. And when that person, when that individual is removed from your life, you can end up feeling very, very lonely and vulnerable and afraid. In fact, the feelings of insecurity can begin to creep in, and you're not quite sure who you can turn to anymore. How are you going to face going forward by yourself? That person is gone. They're no longer available to you. And when the burden is too great and you have no one to go to, what do you do? Some time ago, someone placed an ad in a Kansas newspaper that said, I will listen to you as you talk for 30 minutes without comment. I will listen for $30. You say, well, is that a hoax? Did anybody even call the number? You better believe they did. In fact, the ad was responded to, and pretty soon they had between 10 and 20 callers every single day just wanting someone to listen to what they had to say. As many of you are aware, coming out of the pandemic, people felt very alone, very constrained, very cut off. In fact, you know today that one of the most rampant schemes that's going on is love schemes where people pose as online lovers, and the scam goes on sometimes for a number of months until individuals are duped out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was reading a story about this the other day. Someone had given up over $780,000. They were getting ready to take the money out of their home to give it to this person when a friend of his discovered what was going on, and he spoke some sense into him, and he got him to stop it. But he lost all of that cash that he'd given to this supposed love interest. You see, sometimes we can feel so lonely. We don't know who to go to. We don't know who to trust. Who can we confide in? Well, that's where Samuel was. Imagine now what he's gone through. He's lost his position. He's lost the support of his wife. He doesn't have his mentor any longer. But David's crutch removal project isn't quite over yet. There's somebody else he's going to lose. And we find it here in chapter 20, back again in verse 1, and that is crutch number 4 that had to be kicked away was David's friend. Think about this. Look at verse 1. When David fled to Naioth, where did he go? From Naioth in Ramah, he came to his friend, and who was he? Jonathan. And notice the conversation that ensued. He says to Jonathan in desperation, "What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father, that he's seeking my life? Why is this happening to me?" Notice Jonathan's answer in verse 2. He said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without discussing it and disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Yet David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight." And he has said, "Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death." Oh my goodness. Now that now that David is on the run, he goes to Jonathan, his trusted friend, his closest friend, his companion, and he asks him, he pours out his heart, "What have I done to deserve this? This seems so unfair, so out of control." And Jonathan assures his friend he's not going to die. He's going to make it through this. He's going to be all right. But David is really down. In fact, he is so bleak. He feels absolutely hopeless. His future looks dismal. He's a hunted fugitive. Now, we've all been where David has been. We've all received bad news. We've lost a friend. We've lost a mentor. We feel alone. We've been there before. We've had someone come to us as the bearer of bad news. And we know how that feels. The question is, how long do we stay there? I love this story that I came across some time ago about Thomas Edison. Now, some of us may not be aware of this, but Thomas Edison discovered, developed, invented a number of different things, from the microphone to the phonograph to incandescent light to the storage battery to talking movies and more than 1,000 other inventions. We might say he was the Elon Musk of his day. Okay? But one night in December in 1914, his son recalls one of the most devastating events ever to hit the Edison family. From the plant where they worked, the cry went out, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" And within minutes, all of the packing compounds, celluloid for records and film, and other flammable goods were all burning. Everything was being destroyed. When he couldn't find his father, his son became concerned. Was he safe? With all of his assets being destroyed, would his spirit be broken? But soon he saw his father. He was running toward him in the plant. "Where's your mom?" he shouted. "Go get her, son. Tell her to hurry and bring her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again." The next morning, Edison gathered all of his workers, co-workers, everybody who had been in part of their adventure. He said to them, "We're rebuilding. Lease all the machine shops in the area. Obtain the wrecking crane. Get everything we need." And then as an afterthought, he said, "And by the way, do you know where we can find a little bit of money?" Boy, he had an unsinkable attitude, didn't he? After losing everything, he said, that's not the end. It's just merely an opportunity, a time to start over again. And so that's exactly what he did. Perhaps the loss of David's dear friend was maybe his most painful one of all. So he's lost his position, he's lost the support of his wife, he's lost his mentor, now he's lost the companionship of his dear friend Jonathan. What else could possibly go wrong in David's life? What else could he lose? Well, we're still not done yet. There's a fifth crutch that had to be pushed aside. And that is David's very own self-respect. David's self-esteem. Would you look with me in chapter 21, beginning in verse 10. Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands'?" Ooh. So as a fugitive, David has run out of places to go. There's no place where he can hide in Israel any longer. So where do you think he goes? The Bible tells us that David goes to Gath. Now, do we know anything about the city of Gath? Who was from Gath? Yeah, do you realize that David ran to the hometown of Goliath of all places? What in the world is he thinking? I mean, how desperate does a guy have to be then to run to the home of the giant he just slayed? And yet that's where David finds himself, in Gath of all places. You really have to be pretty desperate to run to enemy territory, but that was his last resort. He was out of options. It's all he could do just to survive. And it didn't take long before his cover was blown. Look at verse 13. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down his beard. You say, "David, what are you doing?" Well, they've discovered who he is. This is the guy who killed Goliath. And so the only way that David can even have a chance to survive is he's got a fake insanity. And so that's exactly what he's doing. David is acting like a madman, like he's insane, like he's lost his mind, just doing something to try to be able to survive as he's there in Gath. And David loses his final crutch, his self-esteem, his self-respect. I would say by this time David is about as low as one could get. Wouldn't you? I want to read you a story for a moment about a modern day family who, just like David, had some of the crutches knocked out from underneath them. Here's the story. Do murderers, child molesters, serial rapists, the East Coast Mafia, the Mexican Mafia, threats and hatred strike a note of terror in your heart? Of course they do. But since when is the life of a pastor's wife touched by such unsavory conduct? Tom and I had moved to a small town, practically zero crime rate. Having grown up in LA, I took real joy from reports in our local newspaper from the town we were now living in when stories like this appeared. Turtle stolen from pet store. Oh my. Oh yes, I was very contented with my new life, feeling very, very safe. The same year, Tom was asked to administrate a Christian school. And my safe little town suddenly went haywire. And all of the sin and degradation seemed to center around the Christian school where my husband was now the principal. The same year Tom was asked to administrate, our dear friends John and Lori were senselessly murdered. They were tortured all night and shot the next morning. This young couple led the Awana program in our town and were dearly loved by everybody in the Christian school. They left 2 babies. One was a 15-month-old girl. The other was an 8-day-old baby boy. Although the children were in the apartment with them, neither was harmed. John and Lori had managed to escape in the early morning hours. Lori carried the babies because John's hands were tied behind him. Their tormentor pursued them. John was shot first, then Lori. She had thrown her body over the 2 children to protect them. My world was shattered. But surely after such an event coming so close to home, one would not expect violence to touch my life again. There is a crutch that's been removed, the loss of a dear friend. It was early fall. The weekly teachers' meeting had been dismissed just a few minutes before when suddenly Cliff, the 4th grade teacher, burst into my husband's office, looking white as a sheet. He said, "Tom, come to my room now." Tom followed Cliff to his classroom where stood the face of a familiar parent, as white, if not whiter, than Cliff's. The reason for all of this panic was soon apparent. The father was accusing the teacher of molesting his 9-year-old son. Cliff was the absolute favorite teacher of students and parents alike in the school. He was probably the most qualified teacher on the staff. His most recent position was with Walk Through the Bible as an instructor. Tom took the 2 men into his office, and after an hour of denials, the teacher finally confessed amid sobbing tears that yes, it was true. He had molested the boy. The months that followed were nothing short of horrendous. Tom, my husband, had to make the call that eventually led to Cliff's arrest and conviction. In the meanwhile, during the investigation, the DA's office did not allow Tom to say why the most beloved teacher in our school had been fired. People were furious and very nasty. The accusations against Tom were cruel and unfair, and worst of all, I couldn't even give my husband's proper defense. Once again, my safe and happy world was shattered. There, the crutch of reputation, gone. I faced the next year full of hope that nothing else bad could happen. Boy, was I wrong. There was a serial rapist loose in the city nearest us. But I assured myself that he was some unknown person in the large city nearby and had nothing whatsoever to do with my life. His rape started striking closer and closer to home until finally one of our teachers was raped. Then one evening there was a telephone call. When I answered the phone, the words spoken on the other end were too horrible for me to even repeat. I quickly slammed down the receiver, terrified that this person had known both my name and my number. Another crutch removed, one's safety, security. 1 month later, the husband of our 2nd grade teacher was arrested as the serial rapist. Can you imagine all of this in one little town and one little school? The DA's office classified him as an extremely dangerous individual. Little did we know. A member of the Mexican mafia. During his trial, my husband was required to testify against him. A few days before giving testimony, we received a threatening phone call from a mafia brother on the East Coast. Joseph was eventually convicted of over 52 different criminal acts and sentenced to several successive life terms. Hopefully, he will never be free again. Why does God sometimes remove those crutches in our lives? Well, let's look as we wrap things up this morning at the truth about crutches. Could we do that? What do we know to be true about crutches? And as we do this, I want to invite you to turn to a passage in the Psalms. Would you turn to Psalm 62 with me for a moment? What is the truth about crutches? What do we need to understand about them? Why does God allow those things that we lean on and that we depend on to sometimes be knocked away from our lives? Well, here's the first reason. Number one is that they can become substitutes for God. They can take the place of God in our life. They can replace our trust in the Lord. And we start looking to someone or something else to support us when God, the righteous, powerful one, is willing and ready to uphold us. I call your attention in Psalm 62 to verses 1 and 2. David writes, "My soul waits in silence for God only. From him is my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be greatly shaken." Verse 5. My soul, wait in silence for God only. For my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be shaken. Sometimes God has to knock away those supports in our life when he knows that other things have become more important and we're leaning more heavily on them instead of the Lord. All right, second truth about crutches today. And that is, secondly, that they keep our focus horizontal. They keep our focus horizontal. You see, when we lean on another person or another thing, our focus goes sideways instead of vertical. And we're constantly looking for another person, and we're relying on another thing instead of the Lord. And that causes us to have a horizontal perspective. Now look at what David says about this again in Psalm 62, but this time in verses 7 and 8. Notice what he says, restoring again that vertical perspective. He says in verse 7, "On God my salvation and my glory rest. The rock of my strength, my refuge is in God." And then he adds in verse 8, "Trust in him," watch this, "at all times. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." You see, when our thinking, our dependence becomes horizontal, God has to knock away the crutches to get us to return to that vertical focus again, where we're looking at him, not at things or people or position or situation or possessions that we tend to want to lean on for comfort and support. We've got to get back looking, trusting vertically the God who saved us. And then notice a third truth about crutches, and that is they offer only temporary relief. Temporary relief. Kind of like, if you will, taking aspirin for a broken leg. Human crutches relieve us of the discomfort and the pain, but it's only for the moment. It's only temporary. They don't provide lasting help. And yet, how often do people run to all kinds of other remedies to soothe or to dull the pain? People take billions of pills and capsules and tablets all the time for a tranquilizing experience in order to endure those storms of life. Don't settle for just temporary relief when our God can give us divine, ongoing relief. Again, would you notice David's words in Psalm 62, verses 11 and 12? Notice he comes to this conclusion at the end of the psalm. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this. What was the message God was trying to get through? Notice what it was. That power belongs to God. That God has everything. It's in His hands. And then he also adds, what else did God reveal to him? And loving kindness is yours, O Lord. For you recompense a man according to his work. He says, Lord, I've heard you say this not once but twice, that all power rests with you, as well as your loving kindness. And you know what, my friends? What more could we want? What more could we need from God than to be reminded that He's the Almighty, the All-Powerful One, and with Him resides tender, compassionate, loving kindness. Isn't that what we really need? There's no substitute for that. There's no substitute for the comfort and the care and the encouragement that God can provide. Now here's the point today. There's nothing wrong with leaning as long as it's on the Lord. And let's be honest. Being stripped of all of the substitutes and the crutches can be a very painful experience on this earth. So we need to relieve ourselves of those crutches before God has to take them away from us. We don't want to make our mate our idol. Our children should not be our idol, nor our position, nor our possessions. None of those should be allowed to be our crutch, other than the Lord. David needed to learn that all-important principle. How about you? Let's pray together. Father, we're thankful today that we can only read and not have to experience all of the things that you had to take David through. And yet there's not one of us here today who hasn't seen or experienced the loss of one or more crutches that we may have been leaning on instead of you. Lord, help our heart and our trust and our devotion and our leaning to be centered completely on you. Not on a loved one, not on a goal, not on a career, not on anything else, but Jesus. And as the choir sang for us earlier today, our hope needs to be in you. Lord, let us trust you at all times, as David learned to do. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, don't forget, our Cafe Coffee Connection is going to happen in just a few minutes, and tonight we'll look forward to the praise ensemble. We'll see you then.